Hey, so you know that you don't want to miss any episodes of 10 Minute Murder. And you want them the moment they're released. The best way to make that happen is to follow in whatever app you're listening right now. Depending on the app, it might say follow or subscribe or collect. Just hit that button and be the first to get new episodes.
10 Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10 Minute Murder.
Hello and welcome to 10 Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for being here. Now, of course, if you find yourself here from part 1, you know that this episode is going to be another long one. It's not a brief 10-minute episode. And if you haven't listened to part 1 of this story, I encourage you to go back and do that before you listen to part 2 of this story. We'll pick up our story on the night of August 8th, 1969.
He said, how do we do it? I said, I don't know how you do it. I don't care how you do it. Do it. Now. Do it. And when I stand on the mountain and I say, do it, it gets done. If it don't get done, then I'll move on it. And that's the last thing in the world you want me to do.
On the night of August 8th, 1969, Tex Watson took Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel to that house where Melcher used to live. As Manson called it, he instructed them to totally destroy everyone in it, and to do it as gruesome as you can. Manson told the women to do as Tex Watson instructed. Krenwinkel, by the way, was one of the early family members and one that met Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys when he picked her up hitchhiking. The occupants of the house at 10050 Cielo Drive that evening were movie actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, and the wife of film director Roman Polanski. Her friend, hairstylist, and former lover, Jay Sebring, Polanski's friend and aspiring screenwriter, Wojciech Frykowski, and Frykowski's girlfriend, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, and daughter of Peter Folger. Polanski was in Europe at the time working on a film project. Music producer Quincy Jones was a friend of Sebring, and he had planned to join them on that evening but ended up not going. Sebring had also invited Steve McQueen to the party at Tate's house on that night. McQueen said later that he invited his girlfriend to come along, but she wanted a romantic night at home instead, so that's what they did. This specific house was chosen because both Tex and Manson had been there before, and Tex was familiar with the layout. This house was one that many celebrities in Hollywood had been to numerous times. The biggest of the big celebrities would show up for parties or just to hang out. You never knew who was going to be there. The Manson family murder team arrived at Cielo Drive just past midnight on August 9th, 1969. Tex climbed a telephone pole near the entrance gate and cut the phone line to the house. They backed their car to the bottom of the hill that led to the estate and walked back up to the house. They thought that the gate might be electrified or equipped with an alarm, so they climbed a bushy embankment to the right of the gate and entered the grounds. Headlights approached them from within the property, and Tex ordered the women to hide in the bushes. He stepped out and told whoever was driving the car to stop. It was Stephen Parent. He had been visiting the property's caretaker, William Garrettson, who lived in the guest house. Tex pointed a .22 caliber revolver at Parent while he begged for his life, claiming that he wouldn't say anything. Tex lunged at Parent with a knife he had in his other hand, giving him a defensive slash wound on the palm of his hand that severed tendons and tore his watch off his wrist. He then shot him 4 times in the chest and stomach, killing him. Tex ordered the women to help push the car up the driveway. Tex Watson next cut the screen of a window, then told Kasabian to keep watch down by the gate. She walked over to Parent's car and waited. Tex removed the screen, entered through the window, and let Atkins and Krenwinkel in through the front door. He whispered to Atkins, giving her instructions, and accidentally awoke Frykowski, who was sleeping on the living room couch. Tex kicked him in the head, and Frykowski asked who he was and what he was doing there. Tex replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." On Tex's direction, Atkins and Krenwinkel found the house's 3 other occupants and forced them to the living room. Tex began to tie Sharon Tate and Sebring together by their necks with a rope he had brought, and he slung it over one of the living room ceiling's beams. Sebring protested their rough treatment of the pregnant Sharon, so Tex shot him. Abigail Folger was taken momentarily back to her bedroom for her purse, and she gave the murderers $70. Tex then stabbed Sebring 7 times. Frykowski's hands had been bound with a towel, but he freed himself and began struggling with Atkins, who stabbed at his legs with a knife. He fought his way out the front door and onto the porch, but Tex caught up with him, struck him over the head with a gun multiple times, stabbed him repeatedly, and shot him twice. Kasabian said she heard horrifying sounds and moved toward the house from her position in the driveway. In an attempt to stop the murders, she told Atkins that someone was coming. Inside the house, Folger escaped from Krenwinkel and fled out of a bedroom door to the pool area. Krenwinkel pursued her and caught her on the front lawn, where she stabbed her and tackled her to the ground. Watson helped finish her off. They stabbed her a total of 28 times. Frykowski was still alive and struggling across the lawn, but Tex murdered him with a final fury of stabbings. Frykowski suffered 51 stab wounds and had also been struck 13 times in the head with the butt of Watson's gun, which bent the barrel and broke one side of the gun grip off. Back inside the house, Tate pleaded to be allowed to live long enough to give birth and offered herself as a hostage in an attempt to save the life of her unborn child. But both Atkins and Watson stabbed Tate 16 times, killing her. Manson had told the women to leave a sign, something witchy, so Atkins wrote "pig" on the front door in Tate's blood. Here is Susan Atkins in 1976 giving an interview describing, from her perspective, what happened that night.
During her Manson years, Susan Atkins dropped acid at least 300 times, and she smoked, swallowed, shot up, and snorted every other drug in sight. And although she had no drugs in her first 5 years of imprisonment, she says it took her that long to fully regain her consciousness, to even begin to realize what she had done. What happened that night you all went to Sharon Tate's house? What really happened?
Well, I remember getting in the car with Tex and Tex Watson and my other 2 co-defendants, 3 co-defendants actually. And before I ever got in the car, Tex and I had our own special little stash of cocaine. I think it was cocaine or methadone, I'm not sure which. We were with speed, and we both snorted some speed and got in the car. We were very, very wired. And we drove to the house with instructions to kill everyone in the house.
From Charlie?
Yeah. And not just that, but that we were instructed to go all the way down every house, hit every house on the street? On the street, yes.
And kill all the people in those houses?
Kill all the people in all those houses. And we went into the house, and I remember that as we went in, a car came up to the driveway, and I remember Tex getting out, and without saying anything, there were gunfire shot. I was in the bushes, and
that's when the young boy Stephen Parent was killed.
He was killed
in the car outside.
Right. The people in the house were all brought into the living room and tied up, and I remember that Wojtek Frykowski, I believe is his name, I had tied his hands with a towel and then was instructed to kill him. And I raised the knife that I had in my hand, and I couldn't put the knife down. I couldn't bring it down. It was just as though there was a force there that held my wrist, and I couldn't move. And as he saw that I couldn't move, then he very easily undid the ties, the towel that I had tied his wrist with, and he and I began to fight. And I remember I was screaming for help, and he was screaming for help, and then Tex came and helped me, and I was left to sit and watch Sharon Tate. And about that time, I can remember seeing people just scattering in different places and running in different places, and I was left sitting with Sharon Tate, and she was talking to me, and I remember that I felt nothing. I felt absolutely nothing for her as she begged for her life and for the life of her baby. And Jesus. I remember when we first went in, one of the people said, "Who are you?" And Tex said, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." And I remember that in my conscience, it's so alive in me, even just recalling it. I remember that I had gone so far and there was no turning back. That even if I had wanted to run, even if I had wanted to leave, I couldn't. It was like I was caught in something that I had no control over. I had absolutely no say-so as to what was happening there. I was just like a tool in the hands of the devil, is the only way I can put it. And I believe that it was by the grace of God that my hand did not go down with that knife on Wojciech Kwiatkowski's chest. I believe that...
Well, who did kill those people?
That night?
Yeah.
Tex. You wanna...
Well, I can ask you now, what did Tex really do there?
Of what I saw happening in Tex, the way he moved, the viciousness and cold. It was just like seeing somebody go crazy with more power than I've ever seen anybody. I don't think he was in control of himself. I think that he was, in their own human strength, could do what Tex did.
Well, Charles Manson was in control of it, right?
Yeah, as far as giving orders, but I don't think Charles Manson's mind was in control of Tex's mind that night. I think that it was a higher power than that. Charlie's human too, you know, and his mental powers are just as limited, maybe not as limited as other humans, but that there was an evil force in control of Tex that night.
Well, it was in control of all of you, obviously.
He did things that, you've heard stories, I'm sure, of people who have lifted up cars off of other people, how they have superhuman strength. Well, Tex had that kind of strength that night. But not for good, it was for evil. So it was harming and hurting people. I only saw him kill those people, and then I've heard later that he has said himself that he was responsible for all the deaths.
At the Tate House?
At the Tate House, yes.
Are you trying to lay the blame off on him?
No. No.
Then what do you think is the point of this?
That the truth be told, that the truth be made known. I tried to take blame from Tex and from Charlie and from Pat and from Leslie by taking and saying that I had killed Sharon Tate and that I had killed Gary Hinman. I tried to take some of the blame and put it on myself because I thought that was my part at that point, and that was a lie. And
in this room were all the survivors of those victims, of yours and the others, their families and their friends. What would you say to them?
Well, about me now is that I'm not the woman that I was in 1969. I'm a new creature in Christ. I've been completely spiritually, mentally, and almost physically born again, though my outside is not changed all that much. The inside of me has changed. That I love them with a love that I don't think any words that I could tell them could express, but only by living a life that may help somebody else, by preventing maybe somebody else from going down the same road, by preventing other survivors of such a terrible thing, is the only way that I could say what I would have to say to them. I just love them. I feel for them. I feel their pain. I feel their sorrows and their loss. And I didn't feel that years ago. I didn't feel anything for them. But today I do feel pain when I think about her and that she's not here, and I don't think that anything that I could say could ease that pain in any of the survivors' hearts. And only God can take care of that. Only God can give them an assurance that their loved ones are with Him, and I believe that with my whole heart. I believe that those people that died that night are with God, and that they're at peace, and it's the only thing that I can tell them. You'd have to understand what acid does to the mind in order to understand how a person can get confused behind drugs. And I would take a thesis, writing a book on what LSD can do to the mind. But
it was powerful enough to keep you in a fog for all those years, even after you stopped using.
I used to think that you came down off an acid trip after 12 hours. That's not true. Every time you take LSD, the moral fiber of your character, which is put in you, or when you grow up, everybody grows up with different morals according to their culture. Okay, when you take acid, your mind expands beyond these moral characteristics and your concepts of right and wrong. So you step out beyond those bounds, and when you step out beyond those bounds, the imagination begins to take over. And the imagination can be a very deceitful thing. It's a fantasy. You think you're coming back to where you started from. Originally, you don't. And every time you drop acid, you get a little bit further away from reality. And I took so much acid that I just was what I would term spaced. And it took me many years to what I term now re-enter. And that was just through not having any acid and having to deal with reality every day.
Well, you say you're operating from a sense of complete consciousness now and reality. But looking back from this point for you, what you were and what you did must be terrifying.
Yes, to realize that by my own free will, I willingly got into something that completely took control over me, that I lost control of myself behind drugs and a process of deprogramming, losing my morals.
It wasn't just drugs, it was Charles Manson's persuasiveness, too.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of deprogramming that was involved in that. You take away a person's conscience of right and wrong by telling them when they're under LSD or any mind-expanding drug, there's no such thing as guilt. And you've already come to a place in your mind or your imagination where you don't like the feeling of guilt, so it's easy to say, yeah, there's no such thing as guilt. I'll believe there's no such thing as guilt, therefore I can do anything and not feel guilty about it.
The next night of August 9th, 1969, 6 family members, Leslie Van Houten, Steve Clem Grogan, and the 4 from the previous night, drove out on Manson's orders. Charles was not happy about the panic attack of the victims at Cielo Drive, so he accompanied the 6 to show them how to do it. After a few hours' ride, in which he considered a number of murders and even attempted one of them, Manson gave Kasabian directions that brought them to 3301 Waverly Drive. This was the home of supermarket executive Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary, a dress shop co-owner. The house was next door to another house in which Manson and family members had attended a party the previous year. According to Atkins and Kasabian, Manson disappeared up the driveway and returned saying he had tied up the people inside the house. He then sent up Tex with Crinwell and Van Houten. In his autobiography, Tex stated that having gone up alone, Manson returned to take him to the house with him. After Manson pointed out a sleeping man through a window, the 2 of them entered through an unlocked back door. Tex added at the trial he went along with the women's account, which he figured made him look much less responsible. As Tex related it, Manson roused the sleeping Lino LaBianca from the couch at gunpoint and had Watson bind his hands with leather. After Rosemary was brought briefly into the living room from the bedroom, Tex followed Manson's instructions to cover the couple's heads with pillowcases. He held those in place with lamp cords. Manson left, sending Krenwinkel and Van Houten into the house with instructions that the couple be killed. Before leaving Spahn Ranch that night, Tex had complained to Manson of how terrible their weapons were from the previous night. Now, sending the women from the kitchen to the bedroom to which Rosemary LaBianca had returned, he went into the living room and began stabbing Leno LaBianca with a chrome-plated bayonet. The first thrust went into the man's throat. Sounds of a scuffle in the bedroom drew Tex there to discover Rosemary LaBianca keeping the women at bay by swinging a lamp that was tied to her neck. After subduing her with several stabs from the bayonet, he returned to the living room and resumed attacking Leno. He was stabbed a total of 12 times. After this attack, the word war was carved into his abdomen. Returning to the bedroom, Tex found Krenwinkel stabbing Rosemary LaBianca with a knife from the LaBianca kitchen. Heeding Manson's instruction to make sure each of the women played a part, Tex told Van Houten to stab Miss LaBianca too. She did, stabbing her approximately 16 times in the back and butt. At trial, Van Houten would claim that Rosemary LaBianca was dead when she stabbed her. Evidence showed that many of Miss LaBianca's 41 stab wounds had, in fact, been inflicted post-mortem. While Tex cleaned off the bayonet and showered, Krenwinkel wrote "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls and misspelled "Helter, Skelter" on the refrigerator door, all in LaBianca's blood. She gave Leno LaBianca 14 puncture wounds with an ivory-handled carving fork, which she left sticking out of his stomach. She also planted a steak knife in his throat. Meanwhile, hoping for another murder scene that night, Manson had gone on to direct Kasabian to drive to the Venice home of an actor acquaintance of hers, dropping off the other 3 family members who had left Spahn Ranch with him that evening at the man's apartment building. Manson drove back to Spahn Ranch, leaving them and the LaBianca killers to hitchhike home. Kasabian messed up this murder by deliberately knocking on the wrong apartment door and waking up a stranger. As the group abandoned that murder plan and left, Atkins defecated in the stairwell. The Tate murders became national news on August 9, 1969. The Polanski's housekeeper had arrived for work that morning and discovered the murder scene. On August 10th, detectives of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction in the Hinman case, informed LAPD detectives assigned to the Tate case of the bloody writing at the Hinman house. Thinking the Tate murders were a consequence of a drug transaction, the Tate team ignored this and the crime's other similarities. The Tate autopsies were underway, and the LaBianca bodies were yet to be discovered. Held briefly as a Tate suspect, Gerritsen, the caretaker, told police he had neither seen nor heard anything on the night of the murder. He was released on August 11, 1969, after undergoing a polygraph. Interviewed decades later, he stated that he had, in fact, witnessed a portion of the murders, as the examination suggested. So I'm not sure why then. The Polanski housekeeper was the first one to call police and report the murders if the caretaker was there when it happened and also saw, at the very least, suspicious activity. The LaBianca crime scene was discovered at about 10:30 p.m. on August 10th, approximately 19 hours after the murders were committed. 15-year-old Frank Struthers, Rosemary's son from a prior marriage, returned from a camping trip and was disturbed by seeing all of the window shades at his home drawn and by the fact that his stepfather's speedboat was still attached to the family car, which was parked in the driveway. He called his older sister and her boyfriend. The boyfriend, Joe Dorgan, accompanied the younger Struthers into the home and discovered Leno's body. Rosemary's body was later found by investigating police officers. On August 12, 1969, the LAPD told press that it had ruled out any connection between the Tate and LaBianca homicides. 4 days after that, the sheriff's office raided Spahn Ranch and arrested Manson and 25 others. But not for what you're thinking. They were suspects in a major auto theft ring that had been stealing Volkswagen Beetles and converting them into dune buggies. Weapons were seized, but because the warrant had been misdated, the group was released a few days later. In a report at the end of August, when virtually all leads had gone nowhere, the LaBianca detectives noted a possible connection between the bloody writings at the LaBianca house and the Beatles' most recent album. Still working separately from the Tate team, the LaBianca team checked with the sheriff's office in mid-October about possible similar crimes. They learned of the Hinman case. They also found out that the Hinman detectives had arrested Beausoleil's girlfriend, Kitty Lutzinger. She was with members of the Manson family brought in on the Volkswagen Beetle case. The car theft arrests had taken place in the desert ranches, where family had moved and were searching Death Valley for a hole in the ground, access to the bottomless pit. A joint force of National Park Service rangers and officers from the California Highway Patrol and the Inyo County Sheriff's Office had raided known ranches that the family lived. The raiders found stolen dune buggies and other vehicles and had arrested 24 people, including Manson. A highway patrol officer found Manson hiding in a cabinet beneath a bathroom sink. The officers had no idea that some of the people they were arresting were involved in the murders. Following up on leads a month after they had spoken with Lutzinger, LaBianca detectives contacted members of a motorcycle gang Manson tried to enlist as his bodyguards while the family was at Spawn Ranch. While the gang members were providing information that suggested a link between Manson and the murders, a dorm mate of Susan Atkins informed LAPD of the family's involvement in the crimes. Atkins was booked for the Hinman murder after she confessed that she had been involved in it. On December 1st, 1969, acting on the information from sources, LAPD announced warrants for the arrest of Tex Watson, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian in the Tate case. The suspects' involvement in the LaBianca murders was noted. Manson and Atkins, already in custody, were not mentioned. The connection between the LaBianca case and Van Houten, who was also among those arrested near Death Valley, had not yet been recognized. Family members that were involved, realizing they were caught, tried to spread out around the country. Tex and Krenwinkel were already under arrest, with authorities in McKinney, Texas, and Mobile, Alabama, having picked them up on a notice from LAPD. Informed that a warrant was out for her arrest, Kasabian voluntarily surrendered to authorities in Concord, New Hampshire on December 2nd. Before long, physical evidence such as fingerprints, which had been collected by LAPD at Cielo Drive, began to connect more dots. On September 1st, 1969, the distinctive .22 caliber high-standard bunt-line special revolver Tex Watson used on Parent, Sebring, and Frykowski had been found and given to the police by Stephen Weiss, a 10-year-old boy who found it and lived near the Tate residence. In mid-December, when the Los Angeles Times published a crime account based on the information Susan Atkins had given her attorney, Weiss's father made several phone calls, which finally prompted LAPD to locate the gun in its evidence file and connect it with the murders via ballistics tests. Acting on that same newspaper account, a local ABC television crew quickly located and recovered the bloody clothing discarded by the family members. The knives used were never recovered, despite a search by some of the same crewmen and months later by LAPD. A knife found behind the cushion of a chair in the Tate living room was apparently that of Susan Atkins, who lost her knife in the course of the attack. The trial began June 15, 1970. The prosecution's main witness was Kasabian, who, along with Manson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel, had been charged with 7 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Since Kasabian, by all accounts, had not participated in the killings, she was granted immunity in exchange for testimony that detailed the nights of the crimes. Originally, a deal had been made with Atkins in which the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty against her in exchange for her grand jury testimony on which the indictments were secured. Once Atkins repudiated the testimony, the deal was withdrawn. Because Van Houten had participated in only the LaBianca killings, she was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy. At first, the judge reluctantly granted Manson permission to act as his own attorney. Because of Manson's conduct, including violations of a gag order and submission of outlandish and nonsensical pretrial motions, the permission was withdrawn before the trial start. Manson filed an affidavit of prejudice against the judge, who was replaced by another judge. On Friday, July 24th, the first day of testimony, Manson appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead. He issued a statement saying that he was considered inadequate and incompetent to speak or defend himself and had X'd himself from the establishment's world. Over the following weekend, the female defendants duplicated the mark on their own foreheads, as did most family members within a day or so. Years later, Manson carved the X into a swastika. The prosecution argued that the triggering of Helter Skelter was Manson's main motive. The crime scene's bloody White Album references were correlated with testimony about Manson predictions that the murders blacks would commit on the outset of the Helter Skelter would involve the writing of pigs on walls in victims' blood. Testimony that Manson had said, "Now is the time for Helter Skelter," was supplemented with Kasabian's testimony that, on the night of the LaBianca murders, Manson considered discarding Rosemary LaBianca's wallet on the street of a black neighborhood. Having obtained the wallet in the LaBianca house, he wanted a black person to pick it up and use the credit cards so that the people, the establishment, would think it was some sort of organized group that killed these people. On his direction, Kasabian had hidden it in the women's restroom of a service station. During the trial, Manson family members loitered near the entrances and corridors of the courthouse. To keep them out of the courtroom proper, the prosecution subpoenaed them as prospective witnesses who would not be able to enter while others were testifying, which is a pretty sneaky move. When the group established itself in vigil on the sidewalk, some members wore hunting knives that were carried legally. Each of them was also identifiable by the X on his or her forehead. Some family members attempted to dissuade witnesses from testifying. Prosecution witnesses Paul Watkins and Juan Flynn were both threatened. Watkins was badly burned in a suspicious fire in his van. Former family member Barbara Hoyt, who had overheard Susan Atkins describing the Tate murders to Tate family member Ruth Ann Morehouse, agreed to accompany the latter to Hawaii. There, Morehouse allegedly gave her a hamburger spiked with several doses of LSD. Found sprawled on a Honolulu curb, Hoyt was taken to the hospital, where she did her best to identify herself as a witness in the Tate LaBianca murder trial. Before the incident, Hoyt had been a reluctant witness. After the attempt to silence her, she was more eager. On August 4th, despite precautions taken by the court, Manson flashed the jury a Los Angeles Times front page whose headline was, "Manson Guilty, Nixon Declares." President Nixon thought that there was a glamorization of Charles Manson within the media. The next day, the female defendants stood up and said in unison that, in light of Nixon's remark, there was no point in going on with the trial. On October 5th, Manson was denied the court's permission to question a prosecution witness, whom defense attorneys had declined to cross-examine. Leaping over the defense table, Manson attempted to attack the judge. Wrestled to the ground by bailiffs, he was removed from the courtroom with the female defendants. During the attempted attack, they had stood up and begun chanting in Latin. After that incident, the judge began wearing a revolver under his robes. On November 16th, the prosecution rested its case. 3 days later, after arguing standard dismissal motions, the defense stunned everyone by resting as well, without calling a single witness. Shouting their disapproval, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten demanded their right to testify. In chambers, the women's lawyers told the judge that their clients wanted to testify that they had planned and committed the crimes and that Manson had not been involved at all. By resting their case, the defense lawyers had tried to stop this. Van Houten's attorney, Ronald Hughes, strongly said that he would not push a client out the window. In the prosecutor's view, it was Manson who had advised the women to testify in this way as a means of saving himself. Speaking about the trial in a 1987 documentary, Krenwinkel said the entire proceedings were scripted by Charlie. The next day, Manson testified. Speaking for more than an hour, Manson said, among other things, that the music is telling the youth to rise up against the establishment. He said, "Why blame it on me? I didn't write the music. To be honest with you, I don't recall ever saying, get a knife and a change of clothes and go do what text says." As the body of the trial concluded, with the closing arguments impending, the defense attorney Hughes disappeared during a weekend trip. When Maxwell Keith was appointed to represent Van Houten in Hughes' absence, a delay of more than 2 weeks was required to permit Keith to get acquainted with the transcripts. No sooner had the trial resumed, just before Christmas, the disruptions of the prosecution's closing arguments by the defendants led the judge to ban the 4 defendants from the courtroom for the remainder of the guilt phase. This may have occurred because the defendants were acting in collusion with each other and were simply putting on a performance, which the judge said was becoming obvious. On January 25, 1971, the jury returned guilty verdicts against the 4 defendants on each of the 27 separate counts against them. Not far into the trial's penalty phase, the jurors saw, at last, the defense that Manson, in the prosecution's view, had planned to present. Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten testified the murders had been conceived as copycat versions of the Hinman murder, for which Atkins now took credit. The killings, they said, were intended to draw suspicion away from Bobby Beausoleil by resembling the crime for which he had been jailed. The plan had supposedly been the work of and carried out under the guidance of, not Manson, but someone in love with Beausoleil, Linda Kasabian. Among the narrative's weak points were the inability of Atkins to explain why, as she was maintaining, she had written political piggy at the Hinman house in the first place. Midway through the penalty phase, Manson shaved his head and trimmed his beard to a fork. He told the press, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." The effort to exonerate Manson via the copycat scenario failed. On March 29, 1971, the jury returned verdicts of death against all four defendants on all counts.
I broke no law. Try to understand that. I broke no law. I didn't step out of line with God, and I didn't step out of line with the man. I did not break the law. Now, I told those people the same thing that the United States president would tell them. The only way that you can dispensate life and death is you have to be willing to give yourself to that cause. You can't fight a revolution. You can't do anything unless you're willing to submit yourself to that cause. Left face. In other words, that's what you learn in the military.
Did you tell them to mutilate so that it would be memorable, so that people would know something was going on? Did you tell them to do it in a memorable way?
Hey, I told you what I told them. If you're going to move, you're going to do something, do it with your soul and your heart. Do it right, man. Don't half-step on it.
Did they do it right?
I don't know. That's up to them. They live with that. They're responsible for their actions. I'm responsible for my actions.
On the day the verdicts recommending the death penalty were returned, news came that the badly decomposed body of Ronald Hughes was found wedged between two boulders in Ventura County. Hughes was the defense attorney that went missing. It was rumored, although never proven, that Hughes was murdered by the family, possibly because he stood up to Manson and refused to allow Van Houten to take the stand and absolve Manson of the crimes. Family member Sandra Good said that Hughes was the first of the retaliation murders. Tex Watson returned to McKinney, Texas after the Tate LaBianca murders. He was arrested in Texas on November 30th, 1969, after local police were notified by California investigators that his fingerprints were found to match a print found on the front door of the Tate home. Watson fought extradition to California long enough that he was not included among the three other defendants tried with Manson. The trial started in August 1971 against Tex. By October, he, too, had been found guilty on 7 counts of murder and 1 on conspiracy. Unlike the others, Tex Watson presented a psychiatric defense, but, like his co-conspirators, Watson was sentenced to death. In February 1972, the death sentences of all 5 parties were automatically reduced to life in prison by People v. Anderson, in which the California Supreme Court abolished the death penalty. After his return to prison, Manson's rhetoric and hippie speeches held little sway. Though he found temporary acceptance from the Aryan Brotherhood, his role was submissive to a sexually aggressive member of the group at San Quentin. Before the conclusion of Manson's Tate LaBianca trial, a reporter for the Los Angeles Times tracked down Manson's mother, remarried and living in the Pacific Northwest. The former Kathleen Maddox claimed that in childhood, her son had suffered no neglect. He had even been pampered by all the women who surrounded him, she said, in case you're wondering if being a bold and habitual liar ran in the family. On November 8, 1972, the body of 26-year-old Vietnam Marine combat veteran James L.T. Willett was found by a hiker. Months earlier, he had been forced to dig his own grave and then was shot and buried poorly. His body was found with one hand protruding from the grave and the head and other hand missing, most likely from scavenging animals. His station wagon was found outside a house in Stockton, where several Manson followers were living, including Priscilla Cooper, Squeaky Frome, and Nancy Pittman. Police forced their way into the house and arrested several of the people inside. The body of James Willett's 19-year-old wife, Rennie Willett, was found buried in the basement. She had been killed recently by a gunshot to the head, and what the family members initially claimed was an accident. It was later suggested that she was killed out of fear that she would reveal who killed her husband, as the discovery of his body had just been seen on the news. The Willett's infant daughter was also found in the house. She was still alive. Michael Monfort pleaded guilty to murdering Rennie Willett, and Priscilla Cooper, James Craig, and Nancy Pittman pleaded guilty as accessories after the fact. Monfort and William Goucher later pleaded guilty to the murder of James Willett, and James Craig pleaded guilty as an accessory after the fact. The group had been living in the house with the Willets while committing various robberies. News reports suggested that James Willett was not involved in the robberies and wanted to move away, but was killed out of fear he would talk to the police. After leaving the Marines, following 2 tours in Vietnam, Willett had been an ESL teacher for immigrant children. In a 1971 trial that took place after his Tate LaBianca convictions, Manson was found guilty of the murders of Gary Hinman and Donald Shorty Shea and was given a life sentence. Shea was a Spawn Ranch stuntman and horse wrangler who had been killed approximately 10 days after an August 16, 1969 sheriff's raid on the ranch. Manson, who suspected that Shea helped set up the raid, had apparently believed Shea was trying to get Spawn to run the family off the ranch. Manson may have considered it a sin that the white Shea had married a black woman, and there was the possibility that Shea knew about the Tate LaBianca killings. In separate trials, family members Bruce Davis and Clem Grogan were also found guilty of Shea's murder. In 1977, authorities learned the precise location of the remains of Shorty Shea, contrary to family claims that Shea had not been dismembered and burned in several places. Contacting the prosecutor in the case, Steve Grogan told him Shea's corpse had been buried in one piece. He drew a map to that pinpointed location, and the body was recovered. Of those convicted of the Manson-oriented murders, Grogan would become, in 1985, the first one to be paroled. On September 5, 1975, the family skyrocketed back into national attention when Squeaky Fromme attempted to assassinate President Gerald Ford. The attempt took place in Sacramento, where she and Manson follower Sandra Good had moved to be near Manson when he was at Folsom State Prison. A search of her apartment turned up evidence that, coupled with later actions on the part of Good, resulted in Good's conviction for conspiring to send threatening communications through United States mail and transmitting death threats by way of interstate commerce. The threats involved corporate executives and U.S. government officials in relation to supposed environmental dereliction on their part. Squeaky Fromme was sentenced to 15 years to life. In December 1987, Fromme escaped from federal prison camp in Alderson, West Virginia, briefly. She was trying to reach Manson, who she heard had testicular cancer. She was caught just days after being on the run. She was eventually released on parole August 14, 2009. It was announced in early 2008 that Susan Atkins was suffering from brain cancer. An application for compassionate release based on her health status was denied in July 2008, and she was denied parole for the 18th and final time on September 2, 2009. Atkins died of natural causes 22 days later. On January 1, 2017, Manson was suffering from gastrointestinal bleeding at California State Prison in Corcoran when he was rushed to Mercy Hospital in downtown Bakersfield. A source told the LA Times that Manson was seriously ill, and TMZ reported that his doctors considered him too weak for surgery. He was returned to prison on January 6th, and the nature of his treatment was not disclosed. On January 15th, 2017, an unauthorized source said that Manson had returned to a hospital in Bakersfield. He died from cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure and colon cancer at the hospital on November 19, 2017. Before his death, Charles Manson was up for parole a total of 12 times, although he refused to actually attend any of those hearings after the one in 1997. The panel noted that Manson had a history of controlling behavior and mental health issues, including schizophrenia and paranoid delusional disorder, and he was too great a danger to be released. The panel also noted that Manson had received 108 rules violation reports, had no indication of remorse, lacked understanding of the magnitude of the crimes, had an exceptional, callous disregard for human suffering, and had no parole plans. At the April 11, 2012 parole hearing, it was determined that Manson would not be reconsidered for parole for another 15 years, at which time he would have been 92 years old.
Are you so afraid of that's got your mind locked up?
No, I don't understand.
Go over to the morgue and look at all them dead people.
Just explain to me, though. I'm not dumb. Explain to me simply why that house that night. Why they
Which
went
house?
there.
Which night?
The house on Shello Drive, the Tate house. Why did they go there that night?
Because Tex had been there before, and he went to a familiar place.
And why did they kill people that night? What did they think they were doing for you?
They freaked out, man. Tex was stoned. He went, everybody was loaded, man.
He said he wasn't. He said he was coming off an LSD trip. He had a little speed.
Well, not around me. He didn't have no speed because I wouldn't allow no speed on that ranch. I kick ass over there. I don't allow that stuff around me. I take a little grass, a little LSD, but none of that is destructive. Anyway, you can ask any of them other girls that'll tell you the other side of this game. I don't play drugs. I play light, dibby dabby chippy, but I don't really get down heavy with it.
What did they think they were?
Are we ready here, man?
Yeah, we're ready.
We ready here? Ready. Okay, ready. War.
What did they think they were?
We are at war now.
But what did they think they were doing for you?
They wasn't doing anything for me.
What did they think they were doing for you?
Okay. If you are me and I am you, everything you do is for you, is for me too.
So what did they think?
If you're in one mind, if I am you and you are me and we are all together, and then who's responsible for come together over me right now? It's all his fault. Oh, no, it's his fault. No, we put another false face on it. It's Halloween. It's your fault. So now, wait a minute. Criminal behavior's the same. It's mundane in most minds. Criminal will always go to a familiar place. Tex had been to that house. Tex went back to that house. Here's the conversation. Indian Mesa. We got 4 campfires. We got 4 queens on a motorcycle gang, a motorcycle group that rides SS motorcycles out of Venice, Santa Monica. So we're riding motorcycles and we're all up there and we got these fires going and we got this big problem that came up. I had to go shoot somebody for Tex. Bobby's in the prison. My brother's in jail. Now, understand my mind, all my life I've been in jail because I didn't have no one to get me out of jail. I didn't have no brother outside. So I spent years and years and years and years just because nobody would come and sign their name and get me out of jail. And the jail couldn't let me out because I didn't have no place to go. So I spent 22 years in prison because I didn't have nobody outside. I can't let somebody that's with me stay in jail. It just ain't, it's not in my makeup, man. I got to get my brother out of jail.
So you needed money to do that.
Well, here's the division between your mind and my mind. Here's where the chamber opens up. When you get in trouble, you go to your mother. You call up mother. I ain't got no mother to call. When you go to the bank, draw some money, pay a lawyer. I ain't got no money. I can't go to no lawyer. I go to a lawyer, I ain't got enough money. I got a little money, and anytime anybody knows anything about lawyers, when you got a little money, they're just taking that. They'll take the little money and let you sue them in court, you dig? In other words, like, I don't have enough money to go to the lawyer to get Bobby out. So everybody's standing around, and I said, pay me. Pay me what you owe me, now. And they said, well, how do we do that? I said, get my brother out of jail. He said, how do we do it? I said, I don't know how you do it. I don't care how you do it. Do it. Now. Do it. And they said, how do we do it? I said, don't ask me how to do it. I don't want to be no part of no conspiracy. But however you do it and get it done now. And they said, well, we don't know what to do. We'll get a lawyer. And then, here, Leslie and Patty, they said, if we get a lawyer, all they're going to do is lie and take our money anyway. Now, system, blame it on your lawyers. If your lawyers ain't lying and taking the money of the poor people, then the poor people got a court to stand on, and they got rights as individuals for a revolution they fought in 1776 that guarantees rights to a common, ordinary farmer, poor man on the street like me. A rebel. I got my rights in the 76 courtroom. If you don't give me my rights in the courtroom, then I become King George. And I got all the rights then. And when I stand on the mountain and I say, do it, it gets done. If it don't get done, then I'll move on it. And that's the last thing in the world you want me to do, because I got that Confederate sword in the kitchen. Don't invoke me. Do it. Get it done. How do we do it? I don't know. I don't want to be involved in it. I keep a close watch on this heart of mine. In Japan, they call it ninja. I don't get involved in violence. I'm not a violent human being.
Did you tell the women to do their witchy things?
I said, if you're going to do something, leave something witchy. Just like I would tell you, if you're going to do something, do it well. And leave something witchy. Leave a sign to let the world know that you were there. Have a good day.
That's today's 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. Thanks for listening today, and that wraps up the 2-part special on the Manson family. This was one that I spent so much time just watching different documentaries on. At one point, I kind of forgot that I was even doing research for an episode. I was just watching because it was so interesting. And to me, the most disturbing part is how the case is looked at nowadays. You can go to YouTube and watch some of the interviews that Charles Manson gave to reporters and magazines at the time. And in the comments section, you always know, don't look at the comments because they're just horrible people in the comments. But in the comments section, I was completely astounded with how many people tried to sympathize with Charles Manson, calling him a genius, saying he was way before his time, just gross stuff like that. I could not believe what I was reading. And I can't believe there are people like that out there. These are the kind of people that should be on like the FBI watch list. Just because he can string together a few sentences that make sense and they sound deep, they try to justify the fact that he helped to take lives of so many people and ruin so many other people's lives. I don't get it. The Manson family was a story suggestion that was submitted by a whole bunch of people. Way too many to mention. But if you would like to submit a story yourself, you can do that. 10minutemurder@gmail.com. It's the number 10minutemurder@gmail.com. Just send me an email and let me know about what story that you would like to hear an episode on. And if you send me an email written out in a way that gives all of the details and chronologically tells the story, I will read exactly that on the podcast. Doesn't matter how long or how short, just put it in an email and send it to me. And I'm going to dedicate an entire episode of nothing but listener-submitted stories. Thank you for listening to 10 Minute Murder. Have a good night.